In the autumn of 1930, when the world economy lay in ruins and millions stood in breadlines across Britain, the shipwrights of John Brown and Company in Clydebank, Scotland, began laying the keel of what would become the largest moving object ever created by human hands. This was not an act of frivolity, but an assertion of national will, a steel promise that Britain would endure, that craftsmanship would triumph over despair, and that the future, however uncertain, still demanded vessels capable of carrying it forward. The ship that would emerge from those Scottish yards 6 years later was christened Queen Mary. After the consort of King George V, she was 1,019 feet of riveted steel and burnished wood, powered by engines generating 160,000 horsepower, capable of transporting 2,139 passengers across the North Atlantic at speeds exceeding 30 knots. But she was more than a compilation of statistics. The Queen Mary became a physical manifestation of an entire civilization's values, its hierarchies and aspirations, its engineering prowess and aesthetic sensibilities, its capacity for both refined elegance and brutal practicality. Across 3 decades of service, this single vessel witnessed and participated in the defining currents of the 20th century. She carried royalty during Britain's constitutional crisis, transporting refugees fleeing European fascism, ferried hundreds of thousands of soldiers to theaters of war, and shepherded war brides to new lives in distant lands. She captured the blue ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing, survived near-catastrophic collisions, and ultimately outlived the very industry that created her. Today, permanently moored in Long Beach, California, she serves as monument, museum, and memorial, a steel chronicle of an age when crossing an ocean was still a journey rather than merely a commute. This is the story of RMS Queen Mary, her conception in economic catastrophe, her brief golden age of transatlantic supremacy, her transformation into the wartime vessel known as the Grey Ghost, and her final metamorphosis into a preserved artifact of maritime history. It is a story inseparable from the broader narrative of Britain's 20th century trajectory, from imperial confidence through existential crisis to diminished but dignified survival. The Queen Mary's story begins not with nautical triumph, but with economic collapse. When the New York Stock Exchange crashed in October 1929, the reverberations crossed the Atlantic with devastating force. Britain's shipbuilding industry, already struggling against foreign competition, faced extinction. Orders evaporated. Yards fell silent. Skilled workers who had built the great vessels of the Edwardian era found themselves queuing for parish relief. Cunard Line, Britain's premier shipping company, had planned an ambitious new vessel to maintain dominance on the lucrative North Atlantic route. Their rival, White Star Line, forever associated with Titanics, lost 17 years earlier, harbored similar ambitions. Both companies understood that the transatlantic passenger trade demanded constant innovation. Ships grew obsolete quickly. Speed and luxury were perishable commodities. In 1930, Cunard contracted with John Brown and Company to construct what was internally designated simply as Job 534. The specifications were extraordinary. This unnamed vessel would displace over 80,000 gross tons, stretching longer than any ship then afloat. 4 Parsons steam turbines would drive 4 massive propellers, each weighing 35 tons. The hull design incorporated novel features: a streamlined bow, carefully calculated plate thickness, and structural reinforcements that would permit sustained high-speed operation in North Atlantic conditions. The keel plates were laid in December 1930 amid considerable fanfare. Here was visible proof that Britain still possessed the industrial capacity for greatness. The Clydebank yard employed thousands. Steel mills roared back to life. For a brief moment, the Depression's grip seemed to loosen. Then reality intruded. By December 1931, with the hull barely begun, Cunard's financial situation had deteriorated catastrophically. Passenger revenues had plummeted. The company faced insolvency. On December 11, 1931, work on Job 534 ceased. The partially completed hull stood silent on the slipway, a rusting monument to interrupted ambition. Over 3,000 workers received dismissal notices in the weeks before Christmas. For nearly 2.5 years, The incomplete hull dominated Clydebank's skyline, visible evidence of failed optimism. Rust bloomed on exposed steel, where penetrated partially constructed compartments. Local children played in the shadow of the dormant giant. The workers dispersed, some to other yards, many to unemployment, a few to emigration. The hull became a symbol not of British industrial might, but of economic paralysis. The political implications proved severe. The Conservative-dominated national government faced mounting pressure to demonstrate economic competence. High unemployment in industrial Scotland threatened Labour electoral gains. The incomplete Cunard ship represented both wasted investment and lost employment. Something had to be done, but neither Cunard nor White Star possessed the capital to proceed independently. The solution, when it emerged, was characteristically British: forced corporate marriage. The government would provide a £3 million loan to complete Job 534 and finance a sister ship, but only if Cunard and White Star merged, eliminating redundant routes and vessels. Negotiations proved contentious. White Star, still profitable on some routes, resented absorption by its rival. Cunard insisted on managerial dominance. Bankers arbitrated competing claims. The Cunard-White Star merger became official in 1934. The conditions were explicit: complete the giant liner, withdraw older vessels from service, rationalize operations. The government loan came with stipulations about British materials and labor. This was industrial policy disguised as commercial rescue, state intervention justified by national prestige and employment necessity. On April 3, 1934, work resumed at Clydebank. The returning workers found the site transformed by neglect. Rust required removal. Some steel plates needed replacement. Machinery had deteriorated. Yet within weeks, the yard thundered with renewed activity. Shifts operated around the clock. The hull grew visibly, adding deck upon deck. The Depression's long pause was ending. Britain was building again. The resumption of construction in 1934 transformed Clydebank into a monument to focused industrial purpose. John Brown and Company employed over 10,000 workers directly on the project, with thousands more in supporting industries supplying materials and components. The scale of the enterprise demanded unprecedented coordination. Every major British steel producer contributed plates and structural members. Manufacturers from across the kingdom supplied specialized equipment: turbines from Parsons Marine, electrical systems from British Thomson Houston, decorative metalwork from dozens of specialized fabricators. The ship's dimensions challenged conventional shipbuilding practice. At 1,019 feet in length and 118 feet in beam, she would be the largest vessel afloat, surpassing Normandy, the French line's stunning new flagship that had entered service in 1935. But size alone was insufficient. The design team, led by naval architects from Cunard's Liverpool headquarters and John Brown's technical staff, prioritized structural integrity and propulsive efficiency. The hull form represented years of tank testing and mathematical calculation. The bow featured a distinctive streamlined profile, cutting through North Atlantic swells with minimal resistance. The stern was equally carefully shaped, managing the complex hydrodynamics where hull met propellers. The propeller design itself was revolutionary: 4 three-bladed screws, each 16 feet in diameter, mounted on manganese bronze shafts running through sealed bearings. These propellers would be driven by steam turbines capable of generating 160,000 shaft horsepower, giving the ship a designed service speed of 28.5 knots, with reserve capacity for higher speeds when competing for the Blue Riband. The ship's strength derived not merely from thick steel, but from intelligent structural design. Longitudinal framing reinforced transverse bulkheads. The hull plates varied in thickness according to stress calculations. The ship was divided into 12 watertight compartments with electrically operated doors that could be closed from the bridge. This arrangement exceeded Board of Trade requirements and reflected hard lessons learned from Titanic and subsequent disasters. As the hull took shape, attention turned to the vessel's public spaces. Here the project's ambitions transcended mere engineering. The Queen Mary would embody Britain's cultural sophistication, its command of the decorative arts, and its mastery of that quintessentially modern aesthetic movement, Art Deco. This design philosophy, emphasizing geometric forms, rich materials, and streamlined elegance, had emerged in France but found enthusiastic British adoption. It represented modernity without the stark severity of Bauhaus functionalism, luxury without Victorian excess. Cunard commissioned Britain's leading designers and artists to create the ship's interiors. The first-class main lounge, stretching across the full width of the ship, would feature intricate marquetry panels depicting world maps executed in rare woods: satinwood, holly, sycamore, rosewood. The panels alone required months of painstaking craftsmanship. The smoking room would be paneled in burr maple with bas-relief friezes depicting maritime history. The first-class dining room, rising through 3 decks, would be the largest room ever installed on a ship, accommodating 800 diners beneath a luminous ceiling concealing indirect lighting, a technical innovation that eliminated the harsh shadows cast by traditional chandeliers. The decorative scheme extended to every detail. Door handles were custom designed. Light fixtures incorporated modern geometric motifs. Even the china, crystal, and silverware reflected careful aesthetic coordination. The intention was clear: passengers should experience a coherent environment where every element, from hull to teaspoon, manifested the same commitment to quality and modernity. Yet this floating palace remained fundamentally a machine, a complex assemblage of mechanical and electrical systems enabling autonomous operation for a week at sea. The engine spaces occupied 7 decks, a cathedral of steel and steam where 160 boilers fed superheated steam to the turbine rooms. The reciprocating motion of expansion and exhaust drove the propeller shafts at calculated revolutions, translated into forward motion through thousands of precisely machined components. Electric generators powered lighting, ventilation, refrigeration, elevators, and communication systems. Distillation plants produced fresh water. Laundries, galleys, and cold storage facilities enabled the ship to function as a self-contained community. The launch, scheduled for September 26, 1934, became a national event. Queen Mary herself agreed to perform the christening, lending her name to the vessel. Enormous crowds assembled along the Clyde to witness the moment when the hull, still incomplete above the waterline, would slide into the river. The launch weight exceeded 35,000 tons, the heaviest object ever moved by human action up to that time. The Queen performed the traditional ritual, severing a ribbon that released the champagne bottle against the hull, pronouncing the words, "I name this ship Queen Mary, may God bless her and all who sail in her." The triggers were released. Drag chains rattled. The hull began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum down the greased slipway. She struck the Clyde with tremendous force, sending waves surging against the opposite bank, and floated immediately, riding high without cargo or superstructure. Tugs secured her and warped her to the fitting-out berth where the real work would continue. The months that followed saw the hull transformed. The superstructure rose deck by deck. 3 massive funnels, only 2 were functional. The third served as ventilation, defined her profile. Lifeboat davits were installed, capable of launching 24 boats with a total capacity exceeding the ship's maximum passenger and crew complement. The interiors progressed from bare steel to finished elegance. Furniture was installed, carpets laid, artwork mounted. The ship began to resemble the designer's vision. On May 27, 1936, RMS Queen Mary departed Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York, carrying 1,288 passengers and a crew of 1,100. The sailing had been delayed 24 hours due to a dock strike, an inauspicious beginning that nevertheless reflected the social tensions persisting through Britain's partial depression recovery. The passengers represented a curated selection of the wealthy, the prominent, and the merely curious. Cunard had distributed complimentary and discounted tickets liberally, ensuring that the maiden voyage would receive maximum publicity. The departure attracted immense crowds. Newsreel cameras recorded the scene as tugs maneuvered the great liner into the Test River and then Southampton water. The ship moved with surprising grace despite her bulk, responding precisely to helm and engine commands. Captain Sir Edgar Britton, a Cunard veteran with decades of North Atlantic experience, maintained cautious speeds through the English Channel and into the western approaches before opening the throttles in open water. The crossing would test both ship and systems. The North Atlantic in late May can be benign or brutal, and weather reports indicated disturbed conditions ahead. As the Queen Mary accelerated, passengers discovered both the vessel's strengths and her limitations. She was fast, maintaining speeds above 28 knots with apparent ease, but the hull design that permitted such speed also transmitted vibration, particularly in the stern sections. The propellers, operating at high RPM, generated resonances that caused fittings to rattle and made conversation difficult in certain cabins. More concerning was the ship's rolling motion. The hull's relatively narrow beam relative to her length, a consequence of prioritizing speed, meant reduced stability in beam seas. When swells struck from the side, the ship rolled noticeably. Cunard would later install stabilizing tanks and eventually mechanical stabilizers, but on the maiden voyage, passengers experienced vigorous motion. The ship's dining rooms, for all their Art Deco splendor, saw numerous empty chairs as seasickness claimed its victims. Yet for those whose stomachs proved reliable, the ship offered unprecedented luxury. The first-class accommodations ranged from standard cabins to elaborate suites with sitting rooms, bedrooms, and private bathrooms finished in marble. The public rooms lived up to their billing. The main lounge, with its soaring ceiling and intricate wood panels, provided space for afternoon tea, cocktails, and evening entertainment. The smoking room attracted male passengers seeking cigars and conversation away from mixed company, a vestige of Victorian social conventions. The swimming pool, tiled in blue and white, offered salt water heated to comfortable temperatures. The class distinctions were absolute. First-class passengers inhabited the upper decks and ship's center, where motion was least pronounced. Tourist class occupied less desirable spaces with simpler furnishings. Third class, still the descendants of steerage, received basic but clean accommodations in the bow and stern. Each class had its own dining rooms, lounges, and deck spaces. Watertight doors and locked passages ensured the boundaries remained inviolate. This was not mere snobbery, but the economic logic of transatlantic shipping. First-class passengers paid premium fares subsidizing the operation. Tourist and third-class passengers filled capacity, contributing smaller margins but essential volume. The crew maintained this elaborate social machinery through continuous labor. Stewards served meals, made beds, delivered drinks, and responded to requests at all hours. Engineers monitored the machinery, adjusting steam pressures and bearing temperatures. Deck officers navigated by celestial observation and dead reckoning. Electronic navigation aids remained primitive. Radio operators maintained contact with shore stations and other vessels, transmitting passenger messages and receiving news bulletins that were posted in public spaces. The maiden voyage progressed without serious incident, though not without problems. The vibration issue required investigation. Some first-class passengers complained about noise. Several mechanical systems required adjustment. But on June 1, 1936, the Queen Mary arrived at New York Harbor to a reception that surpassed even Southampton's farewell. Fireboats sprayed celebratory plumes. Tugboats sounded their whistles. Thousands lined the waterfront as the great liner was warped into her Hudson River pier. The American press provided effusive coverage. Here was tangible evidence that the Depression was ending, that normal commerce was resuming, that the future promised prosperity. The Queen Mary represented not just British achievement, but the revival of transatlantic travel, an industry that connected continents, facilitated business, and enabled cultural exchange. New York's mayor formally welcomed the ship. Cunard executives basked in favorable publicity. The return voyage, departing New York on June 4, carried a nearly full complement of passengers. The westbound crossing proceeded smoothly. The ship arrived Southampton on June 9, having demonstrated her commercial viability. The maiden voyage was judged a success despite the technical issues requiring attention. In the months that followed, the Queen Mary settled into regular service, departing Southampton every few weeks on the 5-day Atlantic crossing. Cunard refined operations based on experience. The vibration problem received attention during scheduled maintenance periods. Adjustments to propeller pitch and balancing reduced, but never eliminated the issue. The ship captured considerable publicity in August 1936 when she wrested the blue ribbon from Normandy, achieving an average westbound speed of 30.14 knots. This was the validation of the ship's design. She was not merely large and luxurious, but genuinely fast, capable of scheduled service at speeds her competitors could not match. Between 1936 and the outbreak of war in September 1939, the Queen Mary established herself as the preeminent vessel on the North Atlantic. This was her golden age, a brief, luminous period when the ship fulfilled her designer's vision, when the investment in steel and craftsmanship generated returns in both profit and prestige. These 3 years represent the apex of an era in ocean travel, a moment when crossing the Atlantic remained adventure rather than routine, when ships were still the primary means of intercontinental travel, when the jet age remained an engineer's speculation. The ship's schedule was demanding but profitable. Each round voyage, Southampton to New York and return, required 11 days, 5 days westbound, a day in port, 5 days eastbound. This permitted roughly 2 round trips per month, with periodic maintenance intervals. Cunard marketed the Queen Mary aggressively, emphasizing speed, comfort, and celebrity. The passenger manifests during these years read like international who's who listings. Industrialists and financiers conducting transatlantic business, Hollywood stars traveling to European locations or London premieres, royalty maintaining international connections, diplomats shuttling between capitals, and socialites for whom the crossing itself was entertainment. The ship became particularly associated with Britain's constitutional crisis of 1936. King Edward VII, having recently ascended the throne after his father's death, was known to favor modern amenities and continental travel. His relationship with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, was already provoking establishment concern when both traveled separately on the Queen Mary during that summer. The press carefully avoided direct reporting. Such matters remained taboo, but everyone understood that the king's domestic arrangements and the ship's passenger lists were connected. When Edward abdicated in December 1936, relinquishing the crown to marry Simpson, the couple's subsequent travels often included passages on the Queen Mary, now as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor rather than sovereign and consort. The ship's celebrity associations extended well beyond royalty. Bob Hope, the comedian whose career was ascending rapidly in the late 1930s, crossed multiple times, entertaining fellow passengers with impromptu performances. Fred Astaire traveled with his sister and dance partner Adele. Clark Gable, at the height of his stardom following Gone with the Wind, made the crossing. These celebrities were not merely passengers, but participants in the ship's mystique, their presence adding glamour that Cunard exploited through discreet publicity. Daily life aboard maintained rigid schedules and social conventions. Breakfast service began at 7 in the dining rooms, though room service was available for those preferring privacy. Morning exercise on the deck promenades was encouraged, weather permitting. Deck stewards provided blankets and bouillon to passengers occupying the wooden chairs lining the promenades. This ritual, inherited from earlier generations of liners, persisted despite seeming anachronistic to younger travelers. Luncheon served at 1 o'clock was formal in first class. Men wore jackets, women wore day dresses. The menus reflected British culinary traditions adapted for international palates: consommes and bisques, roasted meats, steamed vegetables, elaborate desserts. The wine lists featured French vintages alongside British ales and stouts. Afternoon tea at 4, served in the main lounge, was a social highlight, an opportunity for passengers to circulate, meet fellow travelers, and engage in the ritualized conversation that defined first-class social interaction. Evenings brought the day's peak formality. Passengers dressed for dinner, black tie in first class, suits and ties in tourist class. The first-class dining room, that spectacular 3-deck-high space, became a theater of elegant dining. Waiters in white jackets served multi-course meals from silver platters. The ship's orchestra, positioned in a gallery overlooking the dining room, provided musical accompaniment, standards, light classical pieces, show tunes. After dinner, passengers dispersed to various lounges. The smoking room attracted men for brandy and cigars. The main lounge hosted dancing to a full band. The cinema showed recent films. The libraries provided reading material and quiet spaces for correspondence. The crew enabling this elaborate social performance numbered over 1,100. This was not merely a ship, but a complex service organization. Stewards in first class were expected to remember passenger names and preferences. They unpacked luggage, pressed clothing, delivered breakfast trays, and responded to summons at any hour. The ratio of crew to first-class passengers approached 1-to-1, a level of personal service unimaginable in later decades. Tourist and third-class passengers received attentive but less personalized care. Below decks, in spaces passengers never saw, other crew members maintained the machinery enabling this floating luxury. The engine room crew worked 4-hour watches in heat that often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Boiler stokers, even with all-fired boilers, the term persisted, monitored combustion and steam production. Engineers inspected bearings, checked oil pressures, and logged temperatures. The electrical crew maintained generators, repaired lighting, and kept the ventilation systems running. Plumbers addressed the inevitable problems in a vessel with miles of pipes carrying fresh water, salt water, and sewage. Carpenters repaired furniture and maintained wooden decks. This invisible labor sustained the visible comfort. Ships' competition, primarily Normandy on the French line, drove continuous improvement. Normandy was arguably more beautiful. Her Art Deco interiors are still considered the style's finest maritime expression, and she captured the blue ribbon back from Queen Mary in 1937. This friendly rivalry between the two flagships stimulated innovation. Both ships introduced new amenities, improved air conditioning, enlarged swimming pools, enhanced entertainment facilities. The competition benefited passengers while providing endless material for maritime press coverage. Yet even during these golden years, indications of coming crisis were visible to attentive observers. The passenger manifests increasingly included refugees, Austrian Jews fleeing after the Anschluss, German intellectuals abandoning the Reich, Czech citizens escaping occupation. These passengers traveled with different emotions than the vacationing socialites. Their crossings were escapes, not adventures. The ship's manifest books during 1938 and 1939 document this darker traffic, recording people whose names would become footnotes to catastrophe. The ship also carried westbound immigrants, families seeking opportunity in America, young people pursuing careers, the economically desperate seeking better prospects. Third class accommodated these travelers, offering basic but clean dormitory-style cabins and simple meals. For many, the Queen Mary represented hope, the vessel carrying them away from limited prospects toward imagined abundance. In August 1939, as European war became inevitable, Cunard maintained scheduled service with increasing concern. The last peacetime crossing departed Southampton on August 30, 1939, reaching New York on September 4, 3 days after German forces invaded Poland, 2 days after Britain declared war. The ship remained at a New York pier, her future suddenly uncertain. The Golden Age had ended abruptly. The transformation was beginning. The Queen Mary's metamorphosis from luxury liner to military transport represents one of the most complete transformations in maritime history. When war began, the ship was in New York, thousands of miles from home waters increasingly dominated by German U-boats. The British Admiralty faced a decision: order her home risking submarine attack, keep her safely in neutral America, or convert her immediately to military service. The initial decision was to keep her safe. For 8 months, the Queen Mary remained tied to her New York pier, her crew reduced to maintenance watches, her elegant interiors silent. This hiatus ended in March 1940 as Britain's strategic situation deteriorated. The ship received orders to proceed to Sydney, Australia, away from the U-boat threat, where she would be converted for trooping service. The voyage, New York to Sydney via the Panama Canal and across the Pacific, took weeks, carrying the ship through waters where German surface raiders operated. She arrived safely, a testament to her speed. German intelligence knew her location, but lacked assets capable of intercepting her. The conversion at Sydney fundamentally altered the ship's character. The Admiralty's requirements were explicit: maximize troop capacity while maintaining seaworthiness and speed. The elegant first-class staterooms were stripped, their wood paneling and fine furniture removed. Standee bunks, canvas stretched on metal frames, stacked 3 or 4 high, were installed in every available space. The dining rooms, lounges, and public spaces were converted to sleeping quarters. Even the swimming pool was drained and decked over, creating additional berths. The transformation prioritized utility over comfort. Ventilation, designed for 2,000 passengers, now had to serve 5,000 or more. Sanitation facilities, designed for relatively small numbers, served vastly increased populations. The galleys, already substantial, required expansion to produce meals around the clock. The ship's water distillation capacity was increased. Thousands of men consumed water at rates the peacetime systems couldn't sustain. The exterior received equally dramatic modification. The ship's hull, originally black with white superstructure, was painted overall gray, a color scheme designed to reduce visibility and complicate range estimation for attacking submarines. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted, manned by Royal Navy gunners. Degaussing cables were installed to reduce the ship's magnetic signature, lessening vulnerability to magnetic mines and torpedoes. The ship's name was removed from her hull and stern. She became simply His Majesty's Transport Queen Mary, though the troops who traveled on her increasingly called her the Grey Ghost. Her speed, still capable of nearly 30 knots, became her primary defense. The Queen Mary was too fast for U-boat attacks. German submarines, traveling submerged at perhaps 8 knots, couldn't intercept her. Surface attacks by U-boats were suicidal. The Queen Mary could outrun, or, if necessary, ram a surfaced submarine. This speed also meant she traveled alone, without convoy escort, zigzagging across thousands of miles of ocean on courses known only to her captain and Admiralty planners. The ship's first trooping voyage departed Sydney in May 1940, carrying Australian and New Zealand forces to Britain via the Indian Ocean and Cape of Good Hope, the Mediterranean being closed by Italian entry into the war. These were the first of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would travel on the Queen Mary during the war years. The conditions were harsh. Men slept in shifts, alternating between bunks and deck spaces. Meals were served cafeteria-style, queues stretching through passageways. Fresh air was precious. Troops waited turns on deck, a few hours in open air before returning to the crowded, stuffy holds. Yet the ship performed brilliantly. Her machinery, designed for sustained high-speed operation, proved reliable. The crew, now a mixture of Cunard veterans and Royal Navy personnel, developed efficient routines. The ship could embark 5,000 troops, steam halfway around the world, disembark them, and prepare for the return voyage in days. This tempo, maintained for 5 years, made the Queen Mary arguably the most valuable non-combatant vessel in the Allied arsenal. In 1942, the ship underwent further modification in Boston, increasing her troop capacity to over 15,000, more than triple her designed passenger complement. This was achieved through even denser bunking arrangements, hot bunking where possible, and accepting conditions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. American authorities observed the conversion with a mixture of admiration and horror. The ship resembled a floating barracks more than the Art Deco palace that had entered service 6 years earlier. Winston Churchill, traveling to Allied conferences in 1943, chose the Queen Mary as his transport, appreciating her speed and protection. The British Prime Minister's presence aboard underscored the ship's strategic value. Churchill traveled with his military chiefs, planning staff, and support personnel, a floating headquarters crossing the Atlantic while German U-boats prowled uselessly far astern. Churchill later wrote that the Queen Mary and her sister ship Queen Elizabeth were worth several divisions due to their troop-carrying capacity. The ship's record was not unblemished. On October 2, 1942, the Queen Mary was approaching Britain in company with the anti-aircraft cruiser HMS Curacoa, which was providing close escort in waters where air attack was possible. Through a combination of navigational errors and communication failures, the Queen Mary's bow struck Curacoa amidships, cutting the cruiser almost in half. Curacoa sank in minutes, with the loss of 338 men. The Queen Mary, following standing orders that prohibited stopping to rescue survivors when under threat of submarine attack, continued to port. The collision left a gash in her bow, but her watertight integrity was never compromised. Cunard repaired the damage during the next maintenance period, covering the bow with a distinctive patch that remained visible for years. This incident illustrated the brutal calculations of wartime operations. The Queen Mary carried thousands. Stopping to rescue Curaçao's survivors would have exposed those thousands to submarine attack. The Admiralty's orders were explicit, and the captain followed them, though at terrible emotional cost. The collision was later judged the result of mutual navigational error, but the loss of life haunted everyone involved. The ship's troop-carrying operations intensified as the war progressed. In 1944, as D-Day preparations accelerated, the Queen Mary shuttled continuously between New York and Scotland, carrying American troops to Britain. A single voyage in July 1943 carried 15,740 American soldiers, still the record for passengers carried on a single voyage by any vessel. The men were packed into every space, sleeping in shifts, waiting hours for meals, enduring North Atlantic weather without the comforts that had once defined transatlantic travel. After the European War ended in May 1945, the Queen Mary's role shifted to repatriation. She carried war brides, British, French, and other European women married to American servicemen westbound across the Atlantic. These voyages, carrying women and small children rather than soldiers, required different accommodations. The ship still bore her grey wartime livery, but the atmosphere transformed. These passengers represented hope rather than duty, traveling toward new lives rather than battlefields. The Queen Mary's final wartime role was transporting American troops home from Europe. Between mid-1945 and late 1946, she made dozens of crossings, each carrying thousands of servicemen desperate to return to civilian life. These homeward voyages were celebratory despite the continuing hardship of overcrowding. The war was won. These men were survivors, returning to futures they had doubted they would see. By the time the Queen Mary completed her final trooping voyage in September 1946, she had steamed over 600,000 miles during wartime service and carried more than 800,000 military personnel. No other Allied vessel matched this contribution. Churchill's assessment proved accurate. The Queen Mary's capacity to move entire divisions rapidly across oceans had material strategic value. German military planners recognized this. The ship was on priority target lists, but her speed and the vastness of the oceans defeated every attempted interception. The ship that arrived at Southampton in September 1946 bore little resemblance to the elegant liner that had departed for Australia 6 years earlier. The grey wartime paint was weathered and stained. The decks, scarred by countless boots and equipment, needed replacement. The interiors, stripped and modified for trooping, required complete reconstruction. Cunard faced a decision: scrap the ship, sell her, or restore her to commercial service. The choice was never seriously in doubt. The Queen Mary represented too much invested capital, too much national prestige, and too much proven capability. She would be restored. The reconversion took nearly a year and cost over £2 million, more than half her original construction cost. At Southampton's King George V dry dock, workers dismantled the wartime modifications. The standee bunks were removed, revealing the scars of their installation. The hull was repainted in Cunard's peacetime livery: black hull, white superstructure, distinctive red and black funnels. The interiors required extensive reconstruction. Many of the original Art Deco fixtures and furnishings had been stored during the war and were reinstalled. Where original elements had been lost, new ones were commissioned, matching the pre-war aesthetic. The work proceeded deliberately. Cunard recognized that post-war transatlantic travel would differ from the pre-war era. The company's passenger research indicated changing demographics. The extremely wealthy who had dominated first-class travel were less numerous. Wartime taxation and economic leveling had reduced the number of people who could afford the most expensive accommodations. Meanwhile, tourism was emerging as a mass phenomenon. Middle-class Americans, enriched by wartime full employment and eager to experience Europe, represented a growing market. Cunard's response was to reconfigure the ship's accommodations, reducing first-class capacity while expanding tourist class. The new arrangement emphasized comfort across all classes rather than extreme luxury for the few. First class retained considerable elegance, but with fewer suites and more standard cabins. Tourist class was upgraded substantially from pre-war standards. Even third class, now marketed as third-class tourist, offered comfort exceeding pre-war third-class accommodations. The Queen Mary returned to commercial service on July 31, 1947, departing Southampton for New York with 1,996 passengers. The sailing generated enormous publicity. Here was tangible evidence of peacetime's return, of normality's restoration. The British press covered the departure extensively. American newspapers welcomed the ship's New York arrival. The early post-war years were the Queen Mary's second golden age, a period when the ship remained competitive and profitable, when transatlantic travel by sea was still the standard means of crossing. The late 1940s and early 1950s brought full passenger loads. American tourists flocked to Europe, curious about the war's impact and eager to experience cultures they had only read about. British travelers heading to America sought business opportunities or visited relatives who had emigrated. The ship's manifest books from these years show passengers from all backgrounds: businessmen, academics, diplomats, soldiers visiting battlefields, honeymooners, families, immigrants. The ship also transporting notable refugees and displaced persons, survivors seeking new lives in America, intellectuals fleeing Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, Jewish refugees from displaced persons camps who had obtained American visas. These passengers traveled in tourist or third class, their passages sometimes subsidized by aid organizations. Their presence was a reminder that while the war had ended, its dislocations persisted. Celebrity passengers continued to favor the Queen Mary. Elizabeth Taylor and her successive husbands crossed on the ship. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor remained regular passengers, maintaining their transatlantic lifestyle. Political figures, including Dwight Eisenhower and various European heads of state, chose the ship for its speed and prestige. These high-profile passengers generated publicity that Cunard exploited, though the company maintained discretion about passenger manifests unless individuals sought publicity. The ship's routine varied little from the pre-war pattern. Departures were timed to catch tide at Southampton, usually early afternoon. The 5-day crossing followed Great Circle routes adjusted for weather and ice. The daily shipboard routine, meals, entertainment, exercise, proceeded with practiced efficiency. Arrivals at New York occurred early morning, passengers disembarking before noon. After a day in port, refueling, resupplying, loading westbound passengers, the ship departed for Southampton, maintaining the schedule that permitted 2-round voyages monthly. Yet even during these profitable years, technological threats were gathering. Aircraft had evolved dramatically during the war. The Berlin airlift demonstrated that large numbers of people could be moved by air. In 1952, the de Havilland Comet entered commercial service, offering jet-powered transatlantic flights. Though the Comet's early versions suffered catastrophic failures, the principle was proven. Boeing and Douglas were developing larger, more reliable jet transports. Aviation executives spoke confidently of aircraft replacing ships for passenger service. Cunard's response was initially dismissive. Ships offered advantages aircraft could not match: comfort, space, the romantic appeal of ocean travel. The company invested in both Queens, installing stabilizers to reduce rolling, upgrading air conditioning systems, modernizing interiors. The hope was that the ships could remain competitive by emphasizing experience over mere transportation. The 1950s brought changing passenger demographics. American college students began discovering Europe through budget travel. The Queen Mary's third-class accommodations, renamed tourist class to eliminate stigma, attracted this market. These young travelers tolerated basic conditions in exchange for affordable transatlantic crossing. They brought energy and informality that contrasted with the ship's traditional formality. The mixing of demographics occasionally created tensions. Elderly first-class passengers complained about youthful exuberance, while young travelers resented perceived snobbery. The ship's mechanical reliability remained excellent. The engines that had been designed for sustained high-speed operation proved durable across decades. Regular maintenance in dry dock. Every winter, the ship spent weeks in Southampton's dry dock, where her hull was inspected, painted, and repaired, kept her seaworthy. The propulsion machinery underwent periodic overhauls. Boilers were retubed. Turbines were inspected and repaired. This maintenance was expensive but necessary, and Cunard invested in keeping both Queens operational. In 1958, Boeing introduced the 707, a jet transport capable of carrying over 100 passengers across the Atlantic in 7 hours. This was the game-changer Cunard had feared. Pan American World Airways ordered dozens of 707s and began aggressive marketing. The speed advantage was overwhelming: 7 hours by air versus 5 days by sea. Business travelers who had been first-class passengers switched to aircraft. Why waste 5 days when 7 hours achieved the same result? The impact on passenger loads was immediate. First-class bookings declined sharply. Cunard tried to compensate by attracting more tourist-class passengers, but even this market was vulnerable. Charter flights and budget airlines emerged, offering transatlantic passage for prices below ship fares. By the early 1960s, the Queens were operating at 60% capacity, insufficient for profitability given their operating costs. Cunard's financial situation deteriorated. The company had ordered a new flagship, Queen Elizabeth II, designed for dual service, Atlantic crossings in summer, cruising in winter. But the QE2 wouldn't be ready until 1969. Meanwhile, both older Queens were losing money. The Queen Elizabeth, larger but slower than the Queen Mary, was retired in 1968. The Queen Mary's fate hung in balance. The arithmetic was brutal. The ship required a crew of over 1,000. Fuel consumption exceeded 1,000 tons per voyage. Maintenance costs were staggering. The ship was agging, systems were wearing out, and replacement parts were increasingly difficult to source. Insurance costs rose annually. Against these expenses, passenger revenues were falling. By 1966, Cunard was losing hundreds of thousands of pounds annually operating the Queen Mary. The company announced retirement in May 1967. The Queen Mary would make a final season of crossings, then would be withdrawn from service. The news generated nostalgia in the press and among longtime passengers. Articles appeared celebrating the ship's history, lamenting the end of an era. Various preservation proposals emerged: convert the ship to a floating hotel, create a museum, establish a maritime training center. The final commercial season proceeded under the shadow of ending. Passengers booked specifically to experience a last crossing. Some were elderly travelers who had first crossed on the ship decades earlier. Others were maritime enthusiasts documenting the final voyages. The mood aboard was bittersweet, celebration mixed with mourning. The ship's final transatlantic crossing departed Southampton on September 16, 1967, arriving in New York on September 21. Crowds gathered at both ports. Newsreels recorded the departure and arrival. The voyage was fully booked, passengers understanding they were participating in history. Captain John Treasure Jones, who had commanded the ship for 3 years, maintained normal operations despite the emotional weight. In New York, Cunard hosted a farewell ceremony. Company executives, maritime officials, and longtime passengers gathered to honor the ship. Speeches acknowledged her achievements: the blue-ribboned records, the wartime service, the millions of passengers carried safely. The tone was elegiac. Here was the end of ocean liner dominance, the conclusion of an era when ships were humanity's primary means of intercontinental connection. Yet this was not quite the end. A California consortium had purchased the ship for $3.45 million, planning conversion to a hotel and museum in Long Beach. The Queen Mary would make one final voyage, Southampton to Long Beach via Panama Canal, a 14,500-mile journey around Cape Horn to her final berth. The Queen Mary departed Southampton on October 31, 1967, on her final voyage under her own power. The destination was Long Beach, California, where the city and a private development company had agreed to permanently moor the ship as a tourist attraction. The voyage would take 39 days, Covering 14,500 nautical miles through waters the ship had never previously navigated. This final journey was partially nostalgic, partially commercial. Cunard sold 1,093 tickets. The ship sailed nearly full with passengers specifically booking to participate in the historic voyage. The fares were substantial, but included the knowledge that this was the last time the Queen Mary would operate as a moving vessel. After Long Beach, she would never again feel the motion of ocean swells beneath her keel. The route proceeded south from Southampton, past the Bay of Biscay, where she had often encountered rough weather, past the Iberian Peninsula, then across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. The ship transited the Panama Canal on November 10, a passage that required careful piloting. The Queen Mary's beam, at 118 feet, left minimal clearance in the canal locks. Tugboats guided her through with feet to spare. Passengers watched from decks as tropical jungle replaced the familiar North Atlantic seascapes. Once through the canal, the ship entered the Pacific and turned south, heading for Cape Horn. This routing, forced by her size, which prevented transit of the Straits of Magellan, would take the Queen Mary through waters where few large liners had operated. The South Pacific crossing proceeded smoothly, the ship maintaining 16 knots, her machinery performing reliably despite 3 decades of operation. Cape Horn, that legendary maritime hazard, treated the Queen Mary with relative respect. The ship rounded the Horn in moderate weather, experiencing nothing like the storms that had destroyed countless sailing vessels over centuries. Old hands among the crew found this almost disappointing. The Queen Mary was being denied a final test against serious weather. But Captain Treasure Jones was grateful. His responsibility was to deliver the ship safely to Long Beach, not to seek adventure. The voyage north along South America's Pacific coast and then into familiar California waters proceeded without incident. On December 9, 1967, the Queen Mary entered San Pedro Bay and approached her final berth in Long Beach. Tugboats guided her to the specially constructed pier where she would be permanently moored. Lines were secured. Engines that had operated reliably for 31 years were shut down for the final time. The voyage and the ship's active life had ended. The conversion from functioning liner to static hotel and museum began immediately. The challenge was substantial. The ship had been designed to move through water, not to sit permanently at a pier. Engineers removed the propellers and shafts, sealing the stern openings. The forward boiler rooms and engine spaces were partially gutted to create exhibition space. The upper decks underwent conversion to hotel rooms. The original passenger cabins were too small for modern hotel standards, so adjacent cabins were combined, reducing the total number of rooms but increasing their size and amenity. The project encountered immediate difficulties. The engineering required to permanently moor a vessel designed for ocean service proved more complex and expensive than anticipated. The ship's steel hull, always in contact with salt water, required continuous maintenance to prevent corrosion. The watertight integrity that had preserved the ship at sea became a liability. Pump systems failed, water accumulated, causing damage to lower decks. Asbestos, used extensively in the ship's original construction for fireproofing and insulation, posed health hazards, requiring expensive remediation. The Queen Mary Hotel and Museum opened in May 1971, having cost far more than the original $8 million budget. The initial reception was mixed. Maritime enthusiasts appreciated the preservation of a significant vessel. Tourists found the Art Deco interiors fascinating. Hotel guests enjoyed the novelty of sleeping aboard a historic liner, but the economics remained challenging. Operating costs exceeded projections. Attendance fell short of optimistic forecasts. The Long Beach operation changed hands multiple times over subsequent decades, each new operator promising improved management and financial viability. The preservation challenges intensified with time. Salt air corroded exposed steel. The ship's hull, no longer protected by movement through water, suffered from marine growth and corrosion. Multiple deck areas required replacement as steel plates thinned. The original wood decking, which had survived 3 decades of active service, deteriorated rapidly once maintenance schedules relaxed. Interior spaces suffered from deferred maintenance. Ornate plasterwork cracked, wood paneling warped, carpets wore through. Various preservation efforts attempted to address these issues. In the 1980s, a major restoration project restored some first-class public spaces to near-original condition. The dining room received particular attention, with craftsmen repairing the elaborate ceiling and refinishing woodwork. But for every space restored, others continued deteriorating. The ship was simply too large, preservation too expensive, and revenues too uncertain to permit comprehensive maintenance. The Queen Mary's status evolved over decades from active tourist attraction to somewhat shabby memorial. Multiple proposals for enhanced development appeared and disappeared. Add a museum, build adjacent attractions, create event spaces. Each generation of operators promised revitalization. Some improvements occurred, but the fundamental challenge remained. Maintaining a 1,000-foot steel ship built in 1936 exceeded any reasonable business model's capacity. Despite these difficulties, the ship survived. Other preserved liners, the SS United States rusting at a Philadelphia pier, the SS France scrapped after noble service, did not. The Queen Mary's Long Beach berth, for all its problems, represented protection. The ship remained accessible to the public. Thousands of visitors annually toured her decks, dined in her restaurants, and slept in her cabins. School groups received maritime history education. Veterans who had served aboard her during wartime returned, seeking memories and closure. The Queen Mary that rests at Long Beach is simultaneously monument, museum, hotel, and ghost. She represents multiple histories: the ship herself, the era that created her, the people who traveled aboard her, and the maritime culture now largely vanished. Her preservation, however imperfect, allows direct physical engagement with a past that otherwise exists only in documents and photographs. Walking the Queen Mary's decks produces an uncanny temporal displacement. The Art Deco public spaces, the dining room with its soaring ceiling, the observation lounge with its streamlined details, the swimming pool with its period tilework, communicate the aesthetic values of the 1930s with an immediacy no photograph can match. These were spaces designed when geometric ornament represented modernity, when luxury meant materials rather than technology, when craftsmanship was assumed rather than exceptional. The ship also embodies social hierarchies now largely obsolete. The rigid class distinctions preserved in her architecture, first, tourist, and third class, separated by watertight doors and different deck levels, reflect stratified societies where mobility between classes was limited and social boundaries were explicit. Modern visitors find these divisions both fascinating and disturbing. The luxurious first-class cabins exist feet from cramped third-class dormitories. Both populations shared the same ship, but experienced completely different voyages. The wartime modifications, partially preserved in exhibition spaces, provide physical evidence of the ship's second life. The steel bunks, the Spartan facilities, the gun emplacements, these artifacts document the transformation from luxury to utility, from profit to service. Veterans' accounts describe conditions modern sensibilities find almost unbearable. 15,000 men packed into spaces designed for 2,000 passengers, sleeping in shifts, waiting hours for meals, enduring days without seeing daylight. Yet these discomforts paled beside the alternative: months-long trooping voyages in slower ships vulnerable to submarine attack. The Queen Mary serves as memorial to the approximately 800,000 military personnel who traveled on her during the war. No comprehensive passenger list exists, but historians estimate the ship carried men from every allied nation: British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, American, Free French, Polish, Czech, and others. Some traveled to combat, others were returning from it. Some aboard her were wounded, others were prisoners of war being repatriated. For many, the voyage on the Queen Mary was the most significant journey of their lives, the memory remaining vivid decades later. The ship also commemorates the crew who operated her across 3 decades. These included merchant seamen who maintained traditional maritime skills, navigation by celestial observation, mechanical repair without electronic diagnostic tools, operation of steam machinery. The crew represented working-class labor that enabled upper-class luxury. Stewards served passengers who regarded them as nearly invisible. Engineers worked in heat and noise that passengers, insulated by hull design and deck placement, never experienced. These workers rarely appear in the glamorous photographic records of transatlantic travel, yet without them, the entire enterprise would have been impossible. From an engineering perspective, the Queen Mary represents the apex of a particular technological trajectory. She was among the largest, fastest, and most powerful ships built before World War II fundamentally altered naval architecture. Her design incorporated lessons from decades of transatlantic service. The hull form resulted from extensive tank testing. The propulsion system represented the highest development of steam turbine technology. The structural design balanced strength against weight, with calculations performed without computers. Later ships might be larger or more technically sophisticated, but few matched the Queen Mary's combination of size, speed, and mechanical reliability. The ship's survival also raises questions about preservation priorities and cultural memory. Maintaining the Queen Mary costs millions annually. These funds could support other preservation projects, educational programs, or contemporary needs. What justifies preserving one particular ship? The answer involves both tangible and intangible factors. Tangibly, the Queen Mary is simply an extraordinary object, large, complex, historically significant. Intangibly, she represents connections to a past that shaped the present. The soldiers she carried during wartime helped defeat fascism. The immigrants she transported contributed to building modern societies. The technologies she embodied enabled global commerce and cultural exchange. The ship's cultural impact extends beyond her physical presence. The Queen Mary appears in numerous films, usually representing 1930s luxury or 1940s military transport. Books about ocean liners inevitably feature her prominently. Maritime museums display artifacts from her service. Veterans organizations hold reunions aboard her. School curricula use her as a teaching resource for history, engineering, and design education. This cultural presence amplifies her significance beyond the physical artifact. Comparisons with other preserved ships illuminate what makes the Queen Mary significant. The SS United States, larger and faster, sits unused and deteriorating in Philadelphia, preservation failure despite her arguably greater technical achievements. The Normandy, more beautiful, was destroyed by fire during wartime conversion in New York, a loss that maritime historians still lament. The Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mary's sister ship, was scrapped after failed preservation attempts. Among the great transatlantic liners, only the Queen Mary, and to lesser extent, the SS Rotterdam successfully transitioned to preserved status. This survival was not inevitable, but resulted from specific circumstances: Long Beach's investment, California's tourism economy, and the absence of financially viable scrapping opportunities. The ship also functions as time capsule for Art Deco design. Many 1930s buildings have been demolished or substantially altered. The Queen Mary preserves Art Deco spaces largely unchanged. The decorative details, the geometric patterns in metal work, the figured wood panels, the streamlined furniture, demonstrate how thoroughly this aesthetic movement influenced design at every scale. Students of design history can examine these elements in context, understanding how the parts related to the whole. Yet the preservation remains imperfect. Budget constraints necessitate triage. Some spaces are maintained carefully, others deteriorate. The ship's hull suffers continuing corrosion despite maintenance efforts. The original engineering spaces, gutted during hotel conversion, can never be fully restored. Visitors experience an edited version of the ship. Elements deemed significant are preserved, while others are modified or destroyed. This editing reflects contemporary values about what matters in history, which elements deserve preservation, which stories deserve telling. The Queen Mary's story also intersects with broader narratives about technology and obsolescence. She was rendered obsolete not by failure, but by innovation elsewhere. Jet aircraft replaced ocean liners not because ships became worse, but because aircraft became better. This pattern, technologies displaced by alternatives rather than by their own inadequacies, characterizes modern technological change. The Queen Mary functioned perfectly well when retired. She simply couldn't compete with Boeing 707s. Understanding this helps illuminate how technological systems evolve and why particular technologies persist or vanish. From contemporary Long Beach, the Queen Mary presents an ambiguous presence. She remains a tourist attraction, generating economic activity and employment. She provides a distinctive landmark visible across the harbor. She offers educational resources and event spaces. Yet she also represents ongoing financial obligations and preservation challenges. Various proposals for enhanced utilization appear periodically, expand the museum, add attractions, create Maritime Heritage Center. Each proposal founders on economic realities. The ship generates insufficient revenue to cover comprehensive maintenance while creating just enough value to justify continued basic preservation. The Queen Mary's permanent mooring in Long Beach marked not merely one ship's retirement, but the conclusion of ocean liner dominance in transatlantic transport. The era that began with Cunard's Britannia in 1840, 127 years of continuous passenger liner service across the North Atlantic, effectively ended with the Queen Mary's final commercial crossing in September 1967. The Queen Elizabeth II, which entered service in 1969, represented a different model, a dual-purpose vessel emphasizing cruising over point-to-point transport, acknowledging that aircraft had permanently captured the transportation market. What ended with the Queen Mary was a particular relationship between humanity and oceanic space. For over a century, crossing the Atlantic meant surrendering to the ocean's rhythms, experiencing days suspended between continents, inhabiting a mobile community isolated from both departure and destination. This enforced patience shaped experience. Travelers had time to reflect, to converse with strangers, to observe maritime phenomena, to adjust gradually to the transition between cultures. Arrival after 5 days at sea felt earned, the destination seeming more distant and different than arrival after 7 hours in an aircraft cabin. The social dimensions of ocean liner travel also vanished. The ship as microcosm of society, class stratified, formally organized, operating according to explicit rules and implicit conventions, reflected broader social structures that have since eroded. First-class passengers expected deference and received it. Tourist-class passengers accepted limited amenities without complaint. Third-class passengers endured basic conditions gratefully. These expectations reflected societies where class position was relatively fixed, where hierarchy was accepted as natural, where mobility between classes was exceptional rather than assumed. The technologies embodied in the Queen Mary likewise represent a concluded trajectory. Steam turbines driving propellers through reduction gears remain standard for large vessels, but the specific configuration of the Queen Mary's machinery, 4 separate propulsion units, 12 boilers feeding high-pressure steam, independent engine rooms, reflected design philosophies no longer current. Modern ships emphasize efficiency over raw power, accept lower speeds in exchange for reduced fuel consumption, integrate electronic controls unavailable in 1936. The Queen Mary's engine rooms, had they survived intact, would demonstrate an alternative technological path, one emphasizing mechanical robustness, redundancy, and human operation rather than electronic optimization. The ship's preservation at Long Beach provides future generations access to this vanished world, but only partially. Walking the decks cannot recreate the experience of Atlantic crossing, the ship's motion through water, the social dynamics of isolated community, the anticipation of landfall after days at sea. The preserved Queen Mary is a stage without performance, a context without the human activity that gave it meaning. Museum exhibits attempt to fill this gap through photographs, artifacts, recorded accounts, but the experience they document remains fundamentally inaccessible. This limitation affects all preserved ships. The USS Constitution in Boston Harbor cannot convey the experience of sailing into combat. HMS Victory at Portsmouth cannot recreate the Battle of Trafalgar. These vessels preserve physical forms while the lived experiences they once enabled vanish. The Queen Mary suffers the same limitation. She preserves Art Deco interiors, demonstrates marine engineering, provides physical scale and spatial relationships, but cannot restore the human context that made her significant. Yet this imperfect preservation still matters. The Queen Mary's physical presence provides evidence that the past actually existed, that the people who designed, built, operated, and traveled on her were real, that their achievements were substantial. In an age where historical knowledge often comes through screens and texts, the ship's solidity provides reassurance. Her steel plates were riveted by Scottish shipwrights. Her turbines drove her across thousands of ocean miles. Her public spaces hosted thousands of passengers. These facts remain verifiable through direct physical inspection. The ship also serves as monument to particular historical moments and processes. She commemorates the Great Depression and the governmental interventions that sustained employment and industrial capacity. She honors the workers whose skills created her. She memorializes the wartime service that made her strategically significant. She documents the post-war era when Atlantic crossing remained common. She marks the technological transition from sea to air transport. All these historical threads intersect in one physical object. Looking forward, the Queen Mary's future remains uncertain. The ship is approaching her centenary. She will be 100 years old in 2036. Steel ships can survive a century with sufficient maintenance, but the costs are substantial and increasing. Long Beach has periodically considered various futures: comprehensive restoration, partial demolition, conversion to other uses, or even disposal. Each option involves difficult choices about resource allocation, preservation priorities, and cultural values. The most likely outcome is continued gradual deterioration, punctuated by periodic preservation efforts focused on the most significant or accessible spaces. This pattern, common among preserved ships, produces vessels that are simultaneously authentic and artificial, partly original and partly reconstructed, historical artifacts and contemporary interpretations. The Queen Mary may survive her centenary in this hybrid state. Some spaces maintained near original condition, others modified beyond recognition, still others simply closed as preservation becomes impossible. Yet even this imperfect future represents success. Most great liners were scrapped, broken down for steel value, their components dispersed, their existence reduced to photographic records and documentary evidence. The Queen Mary escaped this fate. She remains physically present, accessible, substantial. Children who visit her may not fully understand her significance, but they experience her scale, walk her decks, glimpse the past through imperfect but real preservation. The Queen Mary's ultimate significance may lie not in what she achieved during active service, but in what she represents about human ambition and capability. She was built when such construction seemed nearly impossible, sustained through a war that could have destroyed her, preserved when economic logic argued for scrapping. Her survival represents thousands of individual decisions by designers, workers, crew members, preservation advocates, and officials who collectively ensured her continuation. No single person saved the Queen Mary, rather, successive generations found reasons to keep her. This collaborative, multi-generational preservation mirrors the ship's original creation. The Queen Mary was never merely a vessel but a collective achievement, the product of national industrial capacity, governmental support, worker skill, engineering knowledge, design sophistication, and operational expertise. Her preservation requires similar collective commitment. Those who maintain her today continue work begun by those who built her, operated her, and initially saved her. The ship connects past and present, embodying continuity across nearly a century of profound change. Standing today on the Queen Mary's bridge, looking forward toward the bow rising above the Long Beach waterfront, one sees a ship permanently still yet forever associated with motion. She crossed oceans, carried armies, transporting millions, set speed records, and survived when contemporaries perished. Her engines are silent, her propellers removed, her voyaging ended. Yet she endures, not as she was, but sufficiently intact to honor what she represented. An age when humanity's greatest mobile creations traveled oceanic distances through engineering excellence and human dedication, connecting continents through vessels that embodied both technological achievement and cultural aspiration. The Queen Mary remains a witness to the ambitions of the 1930s, the necessities of the 1940s, the transformations of the 1950s and 1960s, and to the preservation challenges continuing today. Her story is Britain's story in miniature. Greatness achieved through skill and determination, service rendered during existential crisis, adaptation to diminished circumstances, and survival as memorial to vanished glories. She is both herself, a specific ship with particular history, and symbol of larger narratives about technology, society, and memory. As long as she survives at Long Beach, these stories remain accessible, preserved in steel and wood, waiting for those willing to listen to what this great, grey, silent ship still has to tell.